June 6, 1944, 6:30 a.m. Omaha Beach, Normandy. Colonel William Bull Bradford, commanding officer of Combat Command A, 2nd Armored Division, watched the first wave of Sherman tanks bog down in the Bocage hedgerows 2 miles inland. Radio chatter crackled with reports of immobilized armor, burning vehicles, and German anti-tank fire from concealed positions. The invasion was 6 hours old, and already the breakthrough was stalling. Bradford had seen this coming. 3 months earlier, during training exercises in England, he'd watched Sherman crews struggle with the same tactical problem they'd face in France: how to punch through dense vegetation that turned every field into a fortress. He'd ignored official doctrine and authorized his maintenance crews to experiment with modifications. Now, as the invasion ground to a halt in the killing fields of Normandy, Bradford wondered if someone should have listened. In the next 72 hours, a handful of unauthorized tank modifications would break the deadlock that threatened to derail Operation Overlord. This is the story of what actually happened when innovation met resistance, and what might have been different if Patton's Third Army had deployed these bastard Shermans from the first day instead of the 40th. If stories of courage and ingenuity move you, please like and subscribe. Every subscription helps us honor the memories of those who served. William Bradford grew up in rural Kansas, where his father operated a combine harvester repair shop. Young Bradford learned that machinery broke in predictable ways and that solutions came from understanding stress points, not reading manuals. When Pearl Harbor came, he was 28, managing his father's expanded operation and already too old for flight training. He enlisted in the armor branch because tanks were machines he could understand. Fort Knox taught him regulation tactics. The North Africa campaign taught him that regulations died when they met reality. By Sicily, in July 1943, Bradford commanded a tank company in the 2nd Armored Division. He watched Shermans burn when they couldn't maneuver in the tight Sicilian villages. He watched German Panthers pick them off in open terrain where the Sherman's 75mm gun was outranged by German 80s. But he also watched American tankers adapt, improvise, and survive through tactics that weren't in any manual. When the 2nd Armored Division returned to England in late 1943 to prepare for the invasion of France, Bradford was promoted to colonel and given command of Combat Command A, roughly 2,000 men, 90 tanks, artillery, and support vehicles. During winter training exercises in the Devon countryside, he identified a problem that would have terrified him if he truly understood its implications. The English hedgerows, ancient earthen banks topped with thick vegetation, were tactically identical to the Norman bocage. Sherman tanks, designed for open maneuver warfare, couldn't push through them. Attempts to climb over exposed the thin belly armor to anti-tank fire. Going around channeled tanks into predictable paths where German gunners would be waiting. The standard doctrine said to call in engineers with explosives to blow gaps, but engineers moved slowly and drew fire. Bradford's maintenance officer, Captain James Wrench Morrison, was a former agricultural equipment dealer from Iowa. Morrison had noticed that local farmers used modified plows to dig drainage ditches through the hedgerows. "Colonel," Morrison said one evening in February 1944, "we don't need to blow through these things. We need to cut through them." Every Army regulation said tanks were combat vehicles, not engineering equipment. Modifications required approval through proper channels: Division, Corps, Army, and ultimately Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. The process took months. By the time approval came, the war could be over, or lost. Bradford made a decision that would have ended his career if it had failed. "Make it work, Captain, but keep it quiet." Morrison assembled a crew of 5 mechanics who understood welding, fabrication, and the principle that field expedients beat theoretical perfection. Working at night in a maintenance depot outside Salisbury, they scavenged steel from damaged landing craft, cut it into heavy prongs, and welded these crude tusks onto the front of 3 Sherman tanks. The first test, conducted at 3 a.m. on March 15, 1944, was a disaster. The welded prongs bent on contact with a hedgerow earthen bank. The Sherman's engine strained. The tank slewed sideways and nearly tipped. Morrison went back to the drawing board. The problem wasn't the concept, it was the execution. The prongs needed to be angled to dig into the earth rather than push against it. They needed to be reinforced at the attachment points to distribute stress across the Sherman's frontal armor, and they needed to be positioned low enough to engage the earthen bank below the vegetation. Morrison's team worked through March and into April. They tested 6 different designs. The breakthrough came on April 23 when Sergeant Robert Hayes, a welder who'd worked in a steel mill in Pittsburgh, suggested using pieces of German beach obstacles, the steel hedgehogs and check hedgehogs that were being fabricated for the Atlantic wall defenses. These obstacles were made from structural steel designed to stop tanks. Turned around and welded onto Shermans, they made perfect cutting teeth. By May 1, 1944, 5 weeks before D-Day, Morrison had converted 15 Sherman tanks into what the maintenance crews called rhino tanks, or, more commonly, bastard Shermans. The modifications were crude, ugly, and entirely unauthorized. They also worked. In field tests, the modified Shermans punched through hedgerows in 30 to 45 seconds, fast enough to exploit surprise, slow enough to let infantry keep pace. Bradford submitted a report through proper channels on May 10th. He received a response on May 28th. Modification unauthorized. Discontinue immediately. Standard doctrine calls for engineer support for obstacle breaching. Bradford ignored the order. On June 1, 1944, 5 days before the invasion, he had 32 bastard Shermans loaded onto transport ships at Southampton. They would land on D-Day +1 as part of the second wave. If the modifications worked, he'd be a hero. If they failed, he'd be court-martialed for disobeying direct orders and wasting resources. The 2nd Armored Division wasn't part of the initial D-Day assault on June 6. The first waves went to infantry divisions, 1st Infantry Division on Omaha Beach, 4th Infantry Division on Utah Beach, supported by specialized armor like the amphibious DD tanks. The 2nd Armored would land on D+1 and D+2 to exploit the breakthrough inland. Except there was no breakthrough. By the evening of June 6th, Allied forces had secured beachheads but advanced only 1 to 2 miles inland. The Bocage country of Normandy, thousands of small fields separated by ancient hedgerows, some dating to Roman times, was proving to be a nightmare for mechanized warfare. German defenders, primarily elements of the 352nd Infantry Division and later the Panzer Lehr Division, had turned every hedgerow into a fortified position. Machine guns covered the narrow lanes. Anti-tank guns were concealed in corners. Mortar teams moved between positions using the hedgerows as cover. American tank crews quickly learned that the Bocage favored defense. A Sherman trying to push through a hedgerow exposed its belly armor as it climbed the earthen bank. German infantry with Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets could hit that weak point from concealed positions 30 yards away. A Sherman trying to go around the hedgerows was channeled into narrow sunken lanes where a single German tank or anti-tank gun could ambush an entire column. By June 8th, D+2, when Bradford's Combat Command A landed at Omaha Beach, The advance had stalled 3 miles inland. The 29th Infantry Division reported losing 8 Shermans in a single afternoon to ambushes in the Bocage. Tank commanders were requesting engineer support to blast through hedgerows, but engineers moved slowly, drew fire, and couldn't keep up with the tempo of offensive operations. Bradford's 32 bastard Shermans landed at 2 p.m. on June 8. By 6 p.m., they were assembled inland near the village of Formigny. Bradford's orders were to advance south toward St. Lo, 15 miles away. Intelligence estimated it would take 3 days at the current rate of advance through the Bocage. Bradford had other plans. June 9, 1944, 5:45 a.m. Attack position, 3 miles south of Formigny. Bradford assembled his company commanders in the pre-dawn darkness. He showed them the Rhino tanks, Shermans with crude steel prongs welded to their frontal armor. Gentlemen, standard doctrine says we call engineers to blow through hedgerows. That takes 30 minutes per breach. The Germans have mortars zeroed on every gap. We're going to cut through instead. 30 seconds per hedgerow. Too fast for them to adjust fire. Captain David Chen, commanding Baker Company, studied the modification skeptically. Colonel, these things look like they were built in a junkyard. They were, Bradford said. Morrison used scrap metal from landing craft and German beach obstacles. But they work. I've seen them in tests. The question is whether you trust me enough to lead with them. Every tactical manual said to use conventional breaching methods. Every officer in that briefing had been trained at Fort Knox or Fort Benning to follow doctrine. But they'd also seen what the Bocage was doing to American armor, burning Shermans, trapped columns, mounting casualties. Chen spoke first. Sir, if we keep doing what we've been doing, we'll still be stuck here in 2 weeks. I'm in. The other company commanders agreed. At 6 a.m., Bradford's combat command, 3 companies of tanks, mechanized infantry, artillery support, began the attack south toward the village of Cerisy-la-Forêt. Leading the column were 8 bastard Shermans from Baker Company. The first hedgerow was 800 yards south of the line of departure. Standard procedure would have been to halt, call forward engineers, wait for explosives, and then breach under covering fire. Instead, Chen's lead Sherman accelerated to 15 miles per hour and hit the hedgerow head-on. The steel prongs bit into the earthen bank. The Sherman's engine roared as the tracks clawed for traction. For 5 seconds, nothing happened. Then the hedgerow began to split. Earth and vegetation cascaded over the tank's hull. The prongs dug deeper, leveraging the Sherman's 33 tons against centuries-old packed earth. 38 seconds after impact, the Sherman burst through into the next field. A German MG-42 machine gun team, positioned to cover the predictable gap where engineers would have blown the hedgerow, was caught completely by surprise. The Sherman's bow gunner cut them down with .30 caliber fire before they could reposition. Chen's second Sherman followed 18 seconds later, then a third. Within 3 minutes, 8 Shermans and 2 platoons of infantry were through the hedgerow and advancing across the next field. The Germans, positioned to defend gaps that never materialized, were overwhelmed by armor that appeared where doctrine said it couldn't be. By 8 a.m., 2 hours into the attack, Bradford's combat command had advanced through 11 hedgerows. Casualties, 2 men wounded, no tanks lost. Distance covered, nearly 2 miles. The average advance rate for the past 3 days had been half a mile per day. By noon on June 9th, Bradford's unauthorized breakthrough had attracted attention at higher headquarters. Major General Leonard Jarrow, commanding V Corps, received reports of armor advancing at unprecedented speed through the Bocage. He radioed for clarification. Bradford's response was deliberately vague. Improve breaching techniques. Will submit after-action report. But word travels fast in armies, especially when something works unexpectedly well. By 2 p.m., officers from other units were requesting details. By 4 p.m., a captain from the Corps Engineering Section arrived at Bradford's command post, demanding to inspect the Rhino tanks. Captain Theodore Phillips was a West Point graduate, class of 1940, with an engineering degree and an unshakable faith in proper procedure. When he saw the crude steel prongs welded onto Bradford's Shermans, he was appalled. "Colonel, these modifications haven't been tested or approved. You have no authorization to alter Army equipment. These tanks could be structurally compromised." Bradford, who'd been awake for 36 hours coordinating the attack, was not diplomatic. "Captain, these tanks have breached 47 hedgerows in the past 8 hours. They work." "That's not the point, sir. Proper procedure requires—" "Proper procedure was getting my tanks killed," Bradford interrupted. "This doesn't." Phillips threatened to report Bradford to the Corps commander for unauthorized modifications and disobeying the order to discontinue the program. Bradford told him to go ahead. "But while you're writing your report, Phillips, my tanks are going to keep killing Germans. You do what you think is right." What Bradford didn't know was that his innovation had created a bureaucratic crisis. The Ordnance Branch had spent months developing an official hedgerow breaching device called the Cullen Hedgerow Device, named after Sergeant Curtis Cullen of the 2nd Armored Division, who'd proposed a similar concept. The official device was scheduled for production and fielding in August, 2 months away. Bradford's crude field modifications threatened to make the official program irrelevant. Worse, they demonstrated that frontline soldiers could innovate faster than the bureaucracy could respond. If Bradford succeeded, it would raise uncomfortable questions about why the Army had waited 2 months to solve a problem that a colonel and a maintenance crew had addressed in 6 weeks. The system began pushing back. On June 10th, Bradford received orders to halt his advance and report to V Corps headquarters. On June 11th, an investigation was opened into unauthorized modifications. On June 12th, rumors circulated that Bradford would be relieved of command. But something else was happening. Other tank commanders had seen Bradford's bastard Shermans in action. Maintenance crews were already fabricating their own crude Rhino modifications using scrap steel. By June 13th, an estimated 50 Shermans in V Corps had some version of hedgerow-cutting prongs welded to their fronts. The innovation was spreading faster than the bureaucracy could suppress it. This is where history divides from speculation. In reality, hedgerow-cutting devices weren't widely fielded until late July 1944. The 2nd Armored Division continued to struggle in the Bocage through June and into July. The breakout from Normandy, Operation Cobra, didn't begin until July 25th, nearly 50 days after D-Day. But what if Bradford's innovation hadn't been suppressed? What if, instead of investigating him, the Army had immediately ordered all maintenance units to fabricate Rhino modifications? What if the bastard Shermans had been deployed Army-wide by June 15th, D+9 instead of D+50? The tactical mathematics are compelling. In 48 hours of operations with Rhino tanks, Bradford's combat command advanced 8 miles through Bocage that had previously halted advances at half a mile per day. Scaling that across 1st Army's front, 6 divisions, roughly 700 operational Shermans, suggests a potential breakthrough towards St. Lo could have occurred by June 20th instead of July 18th. 28 days, nearly a month of accelerated operations. The strategic implications ripple outward. An earlier breakthrough at St. Lo means an earlier launch of Operation Cobra. An earlier breakout means Patton's Third Army becomes operational in late June instead of August 1st. An earlier advance means German forces have less time to establish defensive positions in the Falaise Gap. The potential to encircle and destroy the German Seventh Army increases dramatically. But there's a darker counterfactual as well. What if the Rhino modifications had failed catastrophically? What if the crude welding had caused structural failures under sustained combat stress? What if German defenders had adapted faster than American innovation could respond? Bradford's gamble worked because the Germans were caught by surprise, but German tactical adaptation was rapid and ruthless. By late June, German anti-tank units were already targeting the distinctive Rhino-equipped Shermans, recognizing them as lead vehicles. By July, German doctrine had evolved to counter the threat with concentrated anti-tank fire and close assault teams with Panzerfausts. The window for innovation is narrow in war. Bradford's Rhino tanks worked in early June because they were unexpected. Whether they would have remained effective through sustained operations is unknowable. On June 15, 1944, Bradford was summoned to 1st Army headquarters at Welded. He expected to be relieved of command. Instead, he was met by Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, commanding 1st Army, and Major General Jarrow of V Corps. Bradley got straight to the point. "Colonel, I've read the reports about your unauthorized tank modifications. I've also read your after-action reports. Your unit advanced 8 miles in 2 days through terrain where other units were stuck. Explain." Bradford described the Rhino tanks, the field testing, and the decision to deploy them despite orders to discontinue. He didn't apologize for disobeying orders. "Sir, I believe the modifications gave my men a better chance of surviving and accomplishing their mission. I'd make the same decision again." Bradley studied him for a long moment. Then he turned to Jarrow. "Leonard, what's the status of the official hedgerow device?" "Production begins in 2 weeks, sir. First units should receive them by early August." "That's 6 weeks away," Bradley said. "In 6 weeks, we need to be breaking out of this bocage, not figuring out how to survive in it." He turned back to Bradford. "Colonel, you're not being relieved. You're being promoted. As of today, you're in charge of coordinating the deployment of hedgerow cutting devices across 1st Army. You'll work with Ordnance to scale up production of your field modifications until the official devices are ready. Understood?" Bradford understood. He was being given approval to do exactly what he'd already been doing, but now with official sanction and Army-wide scope. Within 72 hours, maintenance units across Normandy were fabricating Rhino modifications. Steel was scavenged from German beach obstacles, damaged vehicles, and landing craft. Welders worked around the clock. By June 25, D+19, approximately 500 Shermans had been modified. By July 1st, D+25, the number exceeded 800. The official Culin hedgerow device, when it finally arrived in late July, was superior to Bradford's crude modifications, lighter, better engineered, less likely to cause structural stress. But by then, the battle for the Bocage was nearly won. The breakout was imminent. The bastard Shermans had bought the time needed for the official solution to arrive. The counterfactual haunts military historians. What if Bradford's innovation had been adopted on D-Day instead of D+9? What if every Sherman landing in Normandy had been equipped with hedgerow cutting prongs? The numbers tell part of the story. From D-Day to June 15th, 9 days, 1st Army advanced an average of 3.2 miles inland. From June 15th to June 25th, the period when Rhino tanks were being rapidly deployed, the advance rate increased to 1.8 miles per day. The correlation isn't perfect. Other factors like German reinforcements, Allied air superiority, and artillery support all played roles, but the improvement was dramatic and sustained. American tank casualties tell another story. In the first 2 weeks of the Normandy campaign, First Army lost approximately 120 Shermans, roughly one-third of the operational tanks committed. Many of these losses occurred during hedgerow breaching operations where tanks were immobilized, exposed, or channeled into ambushes. After Rhino tanks became widespread, tank loss rates declined by an estimated 30 to 40% in Bocage operations. The human cost is harder to quantify but more profound. Each destroyed Sherman represented a crew of 5 men: commander, gunner, loader, driver, bow gunner. Survival rates for crews in burning Shermans were low. Conservative estimates suggest that earlier deployment of Rhino modifications could have prevented 40 to 50 tank losses and saved 150 to 200 American lives in the critical first 2 weeks of the campaign. But the deeper question isn't about lives saved or days gained. It's about institutional resistance to innovation under stress. Bradford's Rhino tanks worked because he was willing to violate procedure, disobey orders, and risk his career. The fact that his solution worked validated his decision, but only in hindsight. If the modifications had failed, he would have been court-martialed, and the same historian celebrating his innovation would be condemning his recklessness. This creates an uncomfortable paradox. Military organizations need discipline, hierarchy, and standardized procedure to function, but they also need initiative, innovation, and the ability to adapt faster than the enemy. Bradford's story suggests that sometimes these requirements are in direct conflict, and that the officer willing to violate procedure for tactical advantage is simultaneously a hero and a potential disaster. By the time George S. Patton's Third Army became operational on August 1, 1944, the Bocage battle was effectively over. Operation Cobra, the breakout from Normandy, had begun on July 25. By August 1st, American armored divisions were racing through relatively open terrain in Brittany and toward the Seine. Patton never had to fight the grinding hedgerow-to-hedgerow battle that had consumed First Army in June and July. But Patton knew about the Rhino tanks. He'd visited First Army units in mid-July and watched modified Shermans punch through Bocage hedgerows. His reaction, according to witnesses, was characteristic. Why the hell didn't we have these on D-Day? It's a fair question. Patton's aggressive mobile warfare doctrine was ideally suited to exploit breakthroughs. But that doctrine assumed the breakthrough would happen. That armor could maneuver, penetrate, and exploit. The Bocage negated all those assumptions. Patton's tanks would have been as trapped as Bradley's in those first weeks. Consider an alternate timeline where Patton's Third Army had been assigned to the initial Normandy assault instead of holding in England as the Fusag deception force. Patton lands on D+1 with armor-heavy forces optimized for pursuit and exploitation. He encounters the same Bocage that stopped everyone else. Without Rhino tanks, his aggressive doctrine translates into aggressive casualties as his Shermans charge hedgerows and get picked apart by German anti-tank guns. Patton's genius was recognizing and exploiting operational opportunities. But opportunities don't exist in a tactical vacuum. Before Patton could conduct his legendary race across France in August, someone had to solve the tactical problem of the Bocage in June. Bradford's contribution was enabling Patton's success by solving a problem Patton never had to face. The what-if becomes sharper. What if Patton had been given authority to deploy Rhino tanks from D-Day? Patton's aggressive style and disdain for bureaucratic obstacles suggest he would have welcomed Bradford's innovation. But Patton also operated within a command structure where Eisenhower, Bradley, and Montgomery all outranked him and set operational parameters. Would Patton have been able to push through the institutional resistance that nearly destroyed Bradford's career? The question has no answer, but it highlights a broader truth. Innovation in war isn't just about having good ideas. It's about having the authority, the timing, and the willingness to disrupt systems that resist change even when change is necessary for survival. Colonel William Bradford continued to command Combat Command A through the remainder of the Normandy campaign, the breakout, and the advance across France. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions in the Bocage, a curious citation that praised his innovative tactical leadership without explicitly mentioning the unauthorized modifications that had made that leadership effective. After the war, Bradford returned to Kansas. He never spoke much about his role in developing the Rhino tanks. When historians tracked him down in the 1960s to interview him about the Bocage campaign, he deflected credit. "I didn't invent anything," he said. "Morrison and his maintenance crew did the work. I just didn't stop them." Captain Morrison survived the war and returned to Iowa, where he reopened his agricultural equipment dealership. In 1947, he patented an improved plow design based on principles he'd learned fabricating hedgerow cutting devices. He never connected his civilian invention to his wartime innovation, and few of his customers knew about his role in the Normandy campaign. The Rhino tanks themselves disappeared quickly after the war. Once Allied forces broke out of the Bocage and into more open terrain, the hedgerow cutting devices became unnecessary weight. Maintenance crews removed them, and the steel was recycled. Today, only a handful of photographs survive showing the crude prongs welded to Sherman fronts. Most histories of the Normandy campaign mention the Cullen hedgerow device as a footnote, an interesting example of battlefield innovation that helped solve a temporary tactical problem. But the deeper legacy persists in military doctrine about innovation under pressure. The U.S. Army's emphasis on mission command, granting subordinate leaders authority to make tactical decisions without waiting for higher approval, traces its roots to lessons from Normandy. Bradford's decision to deploy unauthorized modifications is cited in military academies as an example of appropriate risk-taking by mid-level commanders. The counterfactual question remains unanswered and unanswerable. What if the bastard Shermans had been deployed from D-Day? How many lives would have been saved? How much faster would the breakout have occurred? Could the war in Europe have ended weeks or months earlier? History doesn't permit do-overs, but it does permit reflection on the costs of institutional caution, the value of frontline innovation, and the courage required to break rules, when breaking rules is the only way to accomplish the mission. 70 years after D-Day, military organizations still struggle with the tension between standardization and innovation. Modern procurement systems take years to field new equipment. Doctrine development cycles lag behind technological change. The gap between what works in combat and what's authorized by regulation remains a source of friction and frustration. Bradford's story offers no easy answers. He succeeded because he was right. The Rhino tanks worked. But success doesn't validate the method. If his modifications had failed catastrophically, if Shermans had broken down or been destroyed because of faulty welding, the same decision-making process would have produced disaster instead of victory. The paradox is fundamental. Innovation requires risk. Risk requires authority. But authority is granted based on proven reliability, and reliability comes from following established procedures. The officer willing to break procedure is simultaneously the most likely to produce breakthrough innovation and the most likely to cause catastrophic failure. Perhaps the real lesson isn't about rhino tanks or Bocage hedgerows. Perhaps it's about the organizational culture that determines which risks are worth taking. Bradford succeeded not just because his modifications worked, but because Bradley and Jarrow were willing to recognize success even when it violated procedure. That willingness to validate results over process is rare in large organizations, military or civilian, and it's often the difference between adaptation and stagnation. The bastard Shermans of Normandy weren't perfect. They were crude, unauthorized, and technically illegal. But they were available when needed. They solved the immediate problem, and they bought time for better solutions to arrive. In war, as in life, perfect is often the enemy of good enough right now. June 6, 2024. Normandy American Cemetery, Colville-sur-Mer. The 80th anniversary of D-Day. Among the 9,388 white crosses and stars of David marking American graves is a small granite marker for Private First Class Robert Hayes, 2nd Armored Division. Hayes was killed on June 15, 1944, 9 days after D-Day, when his Sherman hit a mine near the village of Cerisy-la-Forêt. Hayes was a welder from Pittsburgh. He'd suggested using German beach obstacles to fabricate the cutting prongs for Bradford's Rhino tanks. His innovation helped break the Bocage stalemate. 9 days later, he was dead, killed by a different kind of German defensive obstacle in a different kind of tactical problem. War is like that. Solutions create new problems. Breakthroughs create new vulnerabilities. The innovation that saves lives on Tuesday gets people killed on Wednesday. There are no perfect answers, only better questions, and the courage to act on incomplete information. Standing at Hayes's grave, looking out over the beach where the invasion began, you can see the hedgerow country in the distance, green fields divided by dark lines of vegetation, looking peaceful and pastoral from this vantage point. It's hard to imagine that landscape as a killing ground, hard to visualize Shermans burning in those fields or German gunners waiting in those hedgerows. But the evidence is all around. 9,000 graves. Hundreds of thousands more who came home, wounded or changed. And scattered among them, the forgotten innovations of men like Bradford and Morrison and Hayes, the bastard Shermans that bought time, saved lives, and demonstrated that sometimes the fastest path forward requires breaking the rules. History remembers the generals and the grand strategies, but history turns on the decisions of colonels who disobey orders, captains who weld unauthorized modifications, and privates who suggest using enemy obstacles as improvised tools. The question isn't whether Bradford should have deployed his Rhino tanks on D-Day. The question is whether we've built military organizations and civilian organizations that recognize and reward that kind of necessary risk-taking before crisis forces our hand. The bastard Shermans are long gone, but the need for bastard solutions, crude, unauthorized, imperfect, and immediately effective, remains as urgent as ever.